Japan started hostilities. Govern yourselves accordingly. With this short and cryptic message sent out by Admiral Hart at 3:10 a.m. on December 8, 1941, December 7, 1941, in Hawaii, the Pacific War began for the United States Asiatic Fleet. Unlike his army counterpart in the Philippines, Hart was not one given to melodrama. Drama was in the substance of the message. Even more drama was in the reaction. Although everyone had anticipated war, it was still a shock nonetheless. Certainly everyone still had more questions than Hart or anyone else had answers. Back home in the United States, civilians were listening to their home radios while broadcasters announced the grim news out of Pearl Harbor and reported the news about the ominous silence coming from Guam. But American soldiers and sailors in the Far East generally had only sporadic access to this news. They had to rely on the unofficial rumor mill and the official words of their superiors, and in the case of Admiral Hart, those words were few indeed. For the men of the seaplane tender William B. Preston, anchored at Malaya Bay in the Philippines, the questions and uncertainty were magnified by isolation not only from the U.S. mainland, not only from the bulk of the U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor, but even from their own Asiatic fleet and their own Patrol Wing 10. Nestled in their hiding place in the western part of the Gulf of Davao on the southern coast of Mindanao, the crew of the Preston had no idea that the long-expected war had finally arrived. Ever since Tommy Hart had taken its helm, the Asiatic fleet had been preparing for war, and it was ready, or at least as ready for war as its limited resources would allow. And the William B. Preston was no exception. Deployed in Malaya Bay with a secret stash of aviation fuel ashore and 3 PBY-4 Catalina flying boats moored on the water, the Preston and her skipper, Lieutenant Commander Etheridge Grant, had been given their orders. They had their plans. Now would be the time to execute. The Preston received Admiral Hart's note that the war had broken out at 3:40 a.m. By 5:15 a.m., one Catalina P6 was already in the air on a scouting mission. The other 2 flying boats, P4 and P7, were moored to buoys close to the beach. In the meantime, Commander Grant set the Preston at Condition 2, which meant that half her guns were manned. No Japanese forces had been reported in the area, but ominously, no one, or at least no one in the Asiatic fleet knew where the fearsome Japanese aircraft carriers were at present. They would soon find out. At 7:10 a.m., the air raid alarm on the Preston sounded. 9 Japanese fighters roared overhead beneath low cloud cover. Not the famous Japanese Zeros, but the older fixed landing gear Mitsubishi A5M4 fighters, to which the Allies would give the reporting name Claude. The Preston opened up with her considerable anti-aircraft guns, but the fighters had no interest in her. Cannons blazing, the Claudes made straight for the 2 moored Catalinas. The PBYs never had a chance. Lacking armor and self-sealing gas tanks, the flying boats were shredded by gunfire. Both Catalinas exploded, vomiting expanding pools of flaming gasoline into the bay. One crewman trying to escape was badly burned and had to be dragged to the beach. Another crewman, Ensign Robert G. Tills, was killed when a bullet went through his skull. He was the first American killed in Asia in the Pacific War. The William B. Preston sent word to Patrol Wing 10 that she was under attack and got under way, moving toward the entrance to the bay for maneuvering room. In her former life, before her conversion to a seaplane tender, the Preston had been a flush-deck destroyer like those of the Asiatic fleet. Whatever the shortcomings of the aged four-pipers as destroyers, they were good as seaplane tenders. Her conversion had cost her some speed, but she could still make 25 knots. She also still retained considerable weaponry. She would need every bit of her destroyer heritage because the Claudes had ignored her for a reason. She was to be the target of someone else. Specifically, 13 Nakajima B-5N carrier attack planes, as the Japanese called them, torpedo bombers as they were known in the West. These B-5Ns would become famous by their reporting name Kate as very deadly torpedo bombers. On this day they emphasized the bomber part of that designation as they circled to bomb the Preston. For some 30 minutes the seaplane tender raced and twisted to avoid their munitions. She was surrounded and drenched by tall geysers of water from exploding bombs, all of which missed. With their bomb racks empty, the Kates followed the Claudes and turned away to fly back to their carrier. The attack at least revealed to the Americans that one of the aircraft carriers was somewhere in the area. But which one? The small size of the attack, the use of older Claude fighters, and an ineffective bombing attack by Cates suggested that this was not the work of the Japanese Naval Air Force's A-Team, and indeed it was not. Unbeknownst to virtually everyone in the Asiatic Fleet, the primary Japanese carrier attack force, the Kido Butai, was away at Pearl Harbor, conducting the very business that had led to Admiral Hart's message. The attack on the Preston and its PBYs had come from the light carrier Ryujo, under the command of Lieutenant Aoi Takahide. It had made an earlier sweep over Davao City, but having found nothing there much to the disgust of Lieutenant Aoi, it proceeded to go after the Preston. Davao City would get a second air raid from the Ryujo later that day, by 2 Cates escorted by 3 Claudes. The city's few anti-aircraft guns managed to damage one Claude sufficiently that it crashed in the Mindanao jungle. The pilot got out, burned the remnants of his aircraft so it would not fall into enemy hands, and killed himself in the true Bushido spirit to avoid capture. This was the first taste the Americans had of the Japanese preference for suicide over surrender, and the news quickly made the rounds of the US forces in the Philippines. The Ryujo was the tip of the spear, or at least the tip of one of the spears held by what would become known as the Japanese octopus, spreading its tentacles all over the Pacific and Southeast Asia. A large number of those tentacles were grouped together into Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake's aforementioned Southern Expeditionary Force, of whose eastern force the Ryujo's specific directives were to provide cover for the planned Japanese landings at Davao and Legazpi in the southern Philippines. In addition to the Ryujo, this covering force consisted of the destroyer Shiokaze directly attached to the carrier to retrieve any pilots with botched takeoffs or landings, the 5th Cruiser Division, consisting of the heavy cruisers Miyoko, Nachi, and Haguro under the command of Rear Admiral Takagi Takeo, and the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, with 8 destroyers being led by the light cruiser Jintsu and Rear Admiral Tanaka Raizo. The Japanese had done their homework. They knew exactly where, when, and what they wanted to attack. The Preston and her flying boats had been spotted in the Malalag anchorage on December 6th. Like all the other Japanese pieces on the Pacific chessboard, the covering force had left Palau on December 6th in order to be close to its targets. It was certainly much closer than Commander Grant or his sailors would have preferred. 2 precious Catalinas had been lost, but his ship had survived unscathed and even shot up a Claude so badly that it had to ditch, though its pilot was rescued. The Preston turned back toward the beach and rescued survivors of the flying boats, but its efforts were cut short by the unexpected return of Catalina P6 with unwelcome news. 3 unidentified destroyers had been sighted 15 miles south of the Gulf of Davao, headed toward the Preston. There were no other US forces in the area. The destroyers had to be Japanese, looking to trap the seaplane tender in the Gulf. Even if she had retained her full destroyer weaponry, the William B. Preston could not expect to survive a bout with 3 Japanese destroyers. Commander Grant ordered the Preston to get out before the trap closed, squeezing out all 25 knots her ancient engines would allow. P6, completely unaware of the earlier attack, was left to make sense of all the messages from Patrol Wing 10 asking for updates on the status of the Preston. Both Tenda and Catalina were ordered to Pollock Bay on the west coast of Mindanao. They were on the run, hunted by an adversary that was more numerous, more powerful and relentless, with whom they had only barely survived their first encounter. The William B. Preston could not win. She could only hope to hold on until the Pacific Fleet arrived to assist her. The crew had no idea what had started all this, what that message from Admiral Hart meant, or when the Pacific Fleet would arrive to help them. It was the first day of the war. News of War, December 8, 1941. The outset of the Pacific War in the Philippines is almost a comparative case study in both how and how not to handle the start of a war. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 8th, Admiral Thomas Hart had been awakened in his room at the Manila Hotel by a phone call around 3 a.m. from Lieutenant Colonel William T. Clement, the duty officer at the Marsman building, who had told the Admiral, "Put some cold water on your face. I'm coming over with a message." The U.S. Navy radio station at Cavite had picked up the general broadcast by Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey of Patrol Wing 2 all the way across the Pacific on Ford Island at Pearl Harbor. Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is not drill. As the staff pondered the signal, another broadcast came in. This official notice from the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor: enemy air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. So Lieutenant Colonel Clement woke the Admiral and went to the Manila Hotel to give him the news. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Hart quickly scrawled the message he had long prepared for this situation. Japan started hostilities. Govern your seals accordingly on a piece of paper, and handed it to his staff for broadcast to the Asiatic Fleet. In so doing, Hart, a veteran of the Spanish-American War and World War I, was so nervous he left out the V. That letter was not all he left out of the message, however, as the William D. Preston was to discover, and as Captain Frank B. Wagner, commander of Patrol Wing 10, found out when Hart's message reached Sangley Point at 3:15 a.m. Like everyone else, Wagner had no idea what Hart's message meant, but he did have a well-rehearsed plan for his aircraft, and he put it into effect. He ordered the Catalinas to perform reconnaissance over the South China Sea, their wings holding deadly 250-pound bombs, but their machine guns filled with training ammunition. In another indictment of American pre-war preparations in the Philippines, it was the only ammunition available. Wagner planned to disperse his seaplanes so they could not all be destroyed at the same time. He sent 7 Catalinas to the Tender Childs in Manila Bay, 5 to Cavite and 4 to Los Baños, on the coast of a lake called Laguna de Bay, 80 miles southeast of Manila. 7 remained at Olongapo to conduct reconnaissance over the South China Sea. Meanwhile, Admiral Hart was conferring with Admiral Glassford before sending him off to Iloilo to command Task Force 5. Given Hart's stated lack of confidence in Glassford, it was unsurprisingly not a pleasant meeting. Glassford was going off to war to command a force of ships, hoary with age, tradition and pride, and strong in little else, with his chances of success and even survival limited. And yet, in his own words, needless to say, I was happy to get away from pessimistic and uncongenial Manila and on my own again. But Admiral Glassford would have to get there first. This would quickly prove to be not quite the routine matter everyone had hoped. Admiral Hart sent Glassford on a barge into Manila Harbour, where after a short visit to his old gunboat Luzon, he made his way to the Langley, where he boarded the PBY that would fly him down to Iloilo. In the meantime, Captain Wagner of Patrol Wing 10 had been informed about the attack on the William B. Preston in Davao Gulf. He greeted the Admiral wearing his helmet, a reminder to Glassford, as if he needed one, that they were at war and that he was about to go off to war in a slow, cumbersome, unarmoured flying boat with no fighter escort. Admiral Glassford and his staff, together with a truckload of luggage, were loaded into Catalina Ep.3. While they were doing so, the crew were busy replacing a defective starter cable, normally a 15-minute repair. They were interrupted by the eerie, ominous wail of air raid sirens. With a large formation of Japanese bombers and fighters approaching, the crew aborted the repair. They would start the flying boat using a hand crank. As sirens continued and the bombers neared, a crewman got the crank, inserted it into the engine, and turned it. The crank promptly snapped off. Swallowing their mounting panic, the crew was able to jury-rig starter cables long enough to get the plane started. After what seemed like an interminably long run across the water, the overloaded Catalina scurried to take off, staying low in what would be a successful effort to avoid the notice of the Japanese aircraft. Behind them, in the distance, they could see giant smoke plumes rising from the direction of Iba and Clark Fields. Destruction of Clark Field, December 8th. The events surrounding the Far East Air Force and its performance in the hours after Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, remain both disputed and controversial, in part a consequence of the chaos that marks the start of any war, with a very critical factual piece missing that will likely never be known. As official Navy historian Samuel Eliot Morison put it, if surprise at Pearl Harbor is hard to understand, surprise at Manila is completely incomprehensible. William Manchester called it one of the strangest episodes in American military history. What can be noted at a minimum, however, is the stark contrast between Admiral Hart's relatively cool, well-planned response with his limited resources and the almost paralyzed response of General Douglas MacArthur with his sizable air forces. A cook from the 20th Pursuit Squadron, Private Harry Seif, was the first soldier at Clark Field to hear of the attack on Pearl Harbor, in this case from a commercial radio broadcast. Rumours like that spread very quickly, and soon the news was all over the airbase complex. It eventually travelled to the other 4 major airfields of the Far East Air Force on Luzon: Nielsen, Nichols, Eba, and Del Carmen. The official Army history explains the reaction among the US troops. By breakfast, the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor had reached all ranks. The men had for so long accepted the fact that war with Japan might come that the event itself was an anticlimax. There was no cheering and no demonstration, but a grim, thoughtful silence. War with Japan was not, for the American and Philippine troops, a remote war across a wide ocean. It was close and immediate. When and how General MacArthur found out is disputed. Most likely, Admiral Hart's Chief of Staff, Admiral William R. Purnell, gave the news to Brigadier General Richard K. Sutherland, General MacArthur's Chief of Staff. At the same time, the signals section of MacArthur's headquarters had picked up the signal from Pearl Harbor and informed Sutherland. Either way, Sutherland telephoned MacArthur at his palatial penthouse on top of the Manila Hotel at about 3:30 a.m. MacArthur's response was said to be incredulous. Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor. It should be our strongest point. At 5:30 a.m. came the first orders from Washington in response to Pearl Harbor, in the form of a radiogram from General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff. It read, "Hostilities between Japan and the United States have commenced. Carry out tasks assigned in Rainbow 5. As a reminder, under Rainbow 5, in the event of hostilities, the defending air forces were to carry out air raids against Japanese forces and installations within tactical operating radius of available bases. The outlying bases were notified of the Pearl Harbor attack, though once again rumours had already beaten the official word. All combat units were placed on alert. By around 4:30 a.m., the pilots of the 17th and 21st Pursuit Squadrons at Nichols Field, on the outskirts of Manila, were sitting in the cockpits or beneath the wings of their P-40Es. So was the 20th Pursuit Squadron at Clark in its P-40Bs. The 34th Pursuit Squadron, located at the much smaller Del Carmen Field, had not been alerted. The 3rd Pursuit Squadron at Iber Field was also ready, even though it had already been through an eventful night. Around midnight, the radar at Iber Field Radar had registered contacts flying in from the north. This was a flight of Japanese bombers on another probe such as they had been carrying out for the previous week. The commander of the 3rd Pursuit Squadron, First Lieutenant Hank Thorne, had ordered his squadron awakened from their sleep, which they were by a réveillé from a bugle boy so excited he could only get one sour blast through his horn. Thorne had ingeniously developed a rudimentary system for night interception. He led a flight of 6 P-40Es into the air and, guided by the Eba radar, attempted to catch the intruders. Unfortunately, the Eba radar only showed contacts, not numbers or altitude. The radar operators watched as the American pursuit intersected that of the Japanese. Thorne's pilots saw no aircraft. The Japanese had been at an altitude of 20,000 feet, and Thorne's squadron had in fact flown under them. The squadron returned to Eba and made the first night landing at that field by the lights of cars and trucks as they shone on the runway. Meanwhile, the command of U.S. Army Forces Far East was breaking down. General Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force, drove from Nielsen to General MacArthur's headquarters to speak to the general. Rainbow 5 required offensive action against the Japanese, and they already had their plan to bomb the Japanese airbase complex at Takao on Formosa. They wanted to get in the first strike and catch the Japanese aircraft on the ground, but Brereton needed MacArthur's permission to carry out the attack. He arrived around 5 a.m., but MacArthur's Chief of Staff General Sutherland prevented Brereton from seeing MacArthur. Why Brereton could not see the general, or more precisely what Sutherland said was the reason, is disputed but included the following. MacArthur was in conference with his senior generals and could not be disturbed. MacArthur was with Admiral Hart and could not be disturbed. MacArthur was with Philippine President Manuel Quezon and could not be disturbed. But Sutherland told Brereton to proceed with his plans and that he would get MacArthur's permission for the attack. Understanding that time was slipping away, General Brereton returned to see General MacArthur at about 7:15 a.m. Again, General Sutherland prevented him from seeing MacArthur and told Brereton that MacArthur had not responded to his request for permission to attack Formosa. After Brereton pressed him, Sutherland went into MacArthur's office, quickly returned, and said MacArthur had denied the request. The general says no, don't make the first overt act. The reasoning, at least as stated by General Sutherland, is bizarre and nonsensical. The phrase first overt act was a specific reference to the war warning of November 27, 1941. Hostile actions possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. A furious Brereton made a fairly logical counter-argument. Damn it, wasn't the bombing of Pearl Harbor an overt act? Can't the general acknowledge that we're at war? The answer would seem to be in the negative. Brereton returned to his headquarters in a fury, his face pale, his jaw hard. The lunacy emanating out of General MacArthur's office by no means ended there. It has been alleged that MacArthur was deferring to the wishes of the Philippine President Manuel Quezon to remain neutral in any Pacific conflict. Quezon denied that, however, and reportedly told Major General Dwight Eisenhower in 1942, MacArthur was convinced for some strange reason that the Philippines would remain neutral and would not be attacked by the Japanese. In any event, the Japanese had already violated Philippine neutrality and attacked the islands directly, with their earlier attack on the William D. Preston in Davao Gulf. General Brereton had not been informed of this attack, and so could not make the argument. Yet MacArthur's headquarters had been informed about the Davao attack at 6:15 a.m., and Sutherland and MacArthur still maintained that Japan needed to commit the first overt act. On top of these absurdities was the fact that General MacArthur was subject to orders from General Marshall to carry out attacks in accordance with Rainbow 5. MacArthur seems to have regarded the directives to attack the Japanese as more what might be called guidelines than actual orders. He was willfully ignoring them. Additionally, it was apparently during this conversation that Sutherland is said to have complained to Brereton about an alleged lack of intelligence information about the Takao airbase complex. Sutherland may have used this as another excuse to delay the attack on Formosa. Brereton returned to his office and told his staff that they could send 3 B-17s on a photo reconnaissance mission over Formosa, the same type of photo reconnaissance mission that General MacArthur had refused to allow the previous week. The staff were incredulous, pointing out that they had enough information to prepare target folders for the attacks, although without calibrated bomb target maps or aerial photographs. At 8 a.m., General Brereton called yet again. General Sutherland called him back at 8:50 a.m. and told him to hold off bombing Formosa for the present. Incredibly, Sutherland also told Brereton not to call again about the planned attack. At about the same time, Brigadier General Gero in General Marshall's office called MacArthur to ask if he had received the cables that Marshall had sent earlier, the ones directing him to attack as directed in Rainbow 5. MacArthur said yes, but offered no explanation for his not having responded sooner. Gero said, "I wouldn't be surprised if you got an attack there in the near future," repeating it for emphasis, and told him not to get caught with his aircraft on the ground, as they had been at Pearl Harbor. MacArthur responded, "Tell General Marshall that our tails are up in the air." This was indeed the truth, though not because of anything General MacArthur had done. A little before 8 a.m., the EBA radar informed the Aircraft Warning Service at Nielsen Field that at least 30 Japanese aircraft were flying south over Luzon, apparently headed for Clark Field. The warning service teletyped that information to the Clark Field headquarters of the 24th Pursuit Group, where its commander, Major Orrin Grover, was responsible for coordinating all the interceptor squadrons on Luzon. The B-17 flying fortresses of the 19th Bombardment Group, sitting at Clark Field, were immediately ordered into the air. They might not be bombing anything, but at least they would not be caught on the ground. Major Grover scrambled 2 squadrons of interceptors, the 20th at Clark and the 17th at Nichols Field, and sent them to patrol at 15,000 feet over Tarlac, 21 miles north of Clark. Grover later claimed that he ordered the 34th to patrol over Clark to take care of any Japanese aircraft that broke through the 17th and 20th, but there is no record of such an order. The P-35s of the 34th might have been enough to take care of a few bombers, but little else. The B-17s and P-40s at Clark Field took to the air with almost nothing in the way of air traffic control, with aircraft crisscrossing as they roared down the runways for takeoff. Miraculously, there were no collisions. At 9:23 a.m., General Brereton received the discouraging news of Japanese air attacks on the U.S. Army base at Camp John Hay near the town of Baguio and a small airfield at Tuguegarao, all in northern Luzon. Brereton ignored General Sutherland's instruction and called again at 10 a.m. Sutherland reiterated that no offensive mission was authorized. In the meantime, MacArthur's headquarters finally received confirmation of the attacks on Baguio and Tuguegarao and the second air attack on Davao City. Evidently considering these the first overt act, at 10:14 a.m., General MacArthur himself apparently called Brereton and authorized strikes on Formosa. Brereton's staff continued with preparations to launch a bombing attack over Formosa at last light in the afternoon. Charts for the attack and overlays pinpointing Japanese airfields were prepared for briefing the pilots and navigators. Meanwhile, for some reason, they decided to continue with the photo reconnaissance mission. In other words, a photo reconnaissance mission to gather information for a bombing strike was to take place at virtually the same time as the bombing strike itself. This, despite the fact that Clark Field did not have enough cameras, forcing an expedition to Nichols Field to pick up additional equipment. While all this was going on, the Warhawks and flying fortresses that had been hurriedly ordered to take off from Clark Field were running out of fuel and had to land. The 17th and 20th Pursuit Squadrons and the 19th Bomb Group had flown back to Clark. The pilots went to lunch while their aircraft were fueled and serviced. The pursuit squadrons of the 3rd at Iba, the 21st at Nichols, and the 34th at Del Carmen remained on the ground the entire time. By 11:30 a.m., in the words of the Army Air Force official history, all American aircraft in the Philippines, with the exception of 1 or 2 aircraft, were on the ground. At 11:27 a.m., the Iba radar picked up a large flight of aircraft some 70 miles away over the Lingayen Gulf, off northwestern Luzon, heading southeast. Iba reported the sighting to the Aircraft Warning Service, where a second attack group heading south over central Luzon was being tracked as well. By 11:37 a.m., the Aircraft Warning Service teletyped the report to Major Grover. Within 10 minutes, Major Grover issued orders to cover both of the major airfields. Iba Field would be patrolled by the 3rd Pursuit, which would also block the first flight of Japanese aircraft, flying southeast off Lingayen Gulf. The all-important Clark Field was going to be patrolled by the 21st Pursuit, which would also serve to block the second flight of Japanese aircraft flying south over central Luzon. These orders, sensible under the circumstances, would be changed within minutes because Major Grover apparently became convinced that the airfields were not the targets. At around 11:45 a.m., he changed his orders and repositioned both the 3rd and 21st Pursuit Squadrons over or near Manila Bay. After urgings from Lieutenant Joe Wagner, commanding the 17th Pursuit Squadron, he ordered that squadron to take off from Clark Field and patrol over Manila Bay. Now, the Far East Air Force would have a sky swarming with P-40 Warhawks at multiple altitudes, ready to repulse any air attack on Manila. As a result of this change in orders, the biggest U.S. airbase in the Philippines, the biggest Allied airbase in the Far East, and a major secondary base, containing the all-important radar set, were unguarded. An entire squadron of fighters, the 20th Pursuit Squadron, was left on the ground at Clark Field without orders. This did not please Colonel Harold George, Chief of Staff for the V Interceptor Command, who was watching the progress of the incoming enemy aircraft and the positioning of his own pursuit squadrons from the plotting room at Nielsen Field. With increasing apprehension over the safety of Clark Field in particular, he sent the code phrase Kickapoo, which meant, as he explained it, "Go get 'em" to the 24th Pursuit Group's headquarters and Major Grover. Whether he actually received it is unknown. But shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Andrew Krieger, flying a Warhawk of the 3rd Pursuit near Manila, was tuned to the 24th Pursuit Group's command radio frequency, over which he heard someone yell, "Tally-ho, Clark Field, tally-ho, Clark Field, all pursuit to Clark, Messerschmitts over Clark, tally-ho," was the code calling the pursuits to converge on the airbase. Messerschmitts was an indicator of the latent racism still present in the American defenders who could not accept the threat presented by the non-white Japanese and assumed the attackers were white Germans in their famous Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. A dozen P-40s 8 from the 3rd and 4 from the 21st Pursuit Squadrons arrived to protect the airbase at around 12:30 p.m., but seeing no enemy aircraft and having no orders, the P-40 pilots headed for Iba. With the Japanese attack group rapidly closing in on Clark Field, the Aircraft Warning Service in desperation sent last frantic warnings to Clark Field using every method at its disposal. But there was, as the Army Air Force history calls it, a breakdown of communications. One breakdown involved the radio call, which never got through. It may have been jammed by the Japanese. The Aircraft Warning Service sent a teletype, but, in another breakdown of communications, the man at Clark Field responsible for monitoring the teletype was at lunch. The Aircraft Warning Service called twice. Here were 2 more breakdown of communications. The first time it left a message. The second time it was told the person responsible would get the message as soon as he came back from lunch. At 12:30 p.m., the Clark Field radio room received a curious series of messages from Iba Field, home of the 3rd Pursuit. A message transmitted in Morse code reported a large flight of aircraft approaching. It was followed by a repeat of the same message by the voice of an increasingly alarmed radio operator at Iba. His frantic transmissions ended abruptly. At about the same time, a Manila radio broadcast had just reported that Clark Field was being bombed by the Japanese. In the mess hall at Clark Field, the report brought laughter. They were still laughing at 12:35 p.m., when a member of the 20th Pursuit on the ground at Clark Field saw coming out of the northwest 2 perfect V, sick of Vs, totaling 53 twin-engine bombers, one behind the other, their wings glistening in the sunlight, heading straight for them. Good God Almighty, yonder they come. Upon seeing the aircraft, Sergeant Bill King fired his pistol 3 times into the air as a warning, then rushed to phone the 20th Pursuit Operations Room, where Major Grover was located. King told the man who answered, First Lieutenant Benny Putnam, to sound the air raid alarm. Upon hearing the message, Grover, who seems to have been in something of a daze, was skeptical, asking, How does he know they are Japanese planes? Overhearing the question, King yelled into the phone at Putnam, We don't have so goddamn many. Only now did the air raid sirens sound. Only now was First Lieutenant Joseph Moore, head of the 20th Pursuit, able to order the red warning flags signalling intercept raised. Only now did the 18 P-40 Warhawks of the 20th Pursuit jump into their cockpits and desperately start taxiing down the runways of Clark Field. It was too late. The Japanese Naval Air Force's 21st Air Flotilla, consisting of the 1st and Kanoya Air Groups, and the 23rd Air Flotilla, consisting of the 3rd, Takao and Tainan Air Groups, and the Japanese Army Air Force's 5th Air Force, all based on Formosa, had been preparing for this attack for approximately a month. They had been scheduled to launch their own attack on the American air bases in the Philippines at dawn, but a particularly bad case of ground fog kept them on the ground until around 11 a.m. Now appearing over Clark Field were 27 Mitsubishi G-4M bombers, which the Allies would call the Betty of the Takao Air Group, and 26 G-3M bombers, which the Allies would call the Nell of the 1st Air Group, their air crews apprehensive, fully expecting that now, 8 hours after Pearl Harbor, American interceptors would be waiting for them. The Japanese had anticipated the possibility of resistance. Concerned about their bombers going into combat with American pursuit aircraft, they experimented with ways to extend the range of their new Zero fighters so they could escort the bombers throughout. By adjusting the fuel mixture and the speed, they were able to do so. So a flight of 34 Zeros of the Tainan and 3rd Air Groups, led by Lieutenant Sakai Saburo, who would become Japan's best fighter ace, escorted the bombers. Sakai, too, expected to see a sky filled with P-40 Warhawks. Instead, the American pursuit aircraft and bombers were still on the airfield. From an altitude of about 20,000 feet, the first V of bombers dropped their munitions, followed by the second V some 15 minutes later. The attack was exceedingly well executed. At 20,000 feet, the anti-aircraft guns of Clark Field could not reach them, nor could the P-40s just taking off. The Nell and Betty bombers lazily dropped their bombs in walking rows or sticks. Hangars, shops, mess halls, barracks and supply buildings were smashed. The radio room received a direct hit, knocking out communications completely. Amazingly, no one had bothered to tell the 19th Bomb Group of the presence of enemy aircraft so they could disperse their bombers. The 19th's flying fortresses were sitting in nice, neat rows, their silver bodies shining in the sun. 2 B-17s had managed to take off, as had Lieutenant Moore and 2 other Warhawks of the 20th Pursuit, all of which immediately went into maximum climbs, though this made no difference now. Another P-40, making its takeoff run, had its tires blown by bomb shrapnel and had to abort. 4 more P-40s were destroyed by bombs as they attempted to take off, and it would get worse. Lieutenant Sakai's Zeros shepherded their charges away from any possible American pursuit, then turned around and spent the next hour making repeated low-level strafing runs on Clark Field, specifically targeting the remaining aircraft. With few exceptions, the anti-aircraft gunners of the U.S. Army's 200th Coast Artillery Regiment heroically stood by their guns in the face of the strafing. Ground and combat crews even turned the machine guns of grounded aircraft on low-flying Japanese aircraft, or undertook to rescue valuable equipment from the burning ground installations. Lieutenant Fred Crimmins received severe wounds in a vain attempt to save a B-17. Chaplain Joseph F. Lafleur repeatedly ignored low-flying strafers to minister to the wounded and dying, and Private First Class Greeley B. Williams, from a gunner's post in one of the B-17s, kept up a steady fire on Japanese aircraft until he was killed. But it was hopeless. With communications now cut off, there could be no reinforcements. No one could contact the 17th and 21st Pursuit Squadrons, now uselessly protecting the approaches to Manila. But the 20th Pursuit did get those 3 P-40s into the air. There, Lieutenant Randall B. Keeter attacked a flight of 3 Zeros and acquired the distinction of shooting down the first Japanese aircraft over the Philippines. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Moore, in a series of dogfights, destroyed 2 others. At Del Carmen Field, some 15 miles away, pilots of the 34th Squadron, seeing great clouds of smoke and dust billowing from Clark some 20,000 feet into the air, immediately scrambled their P-35s to try to help. Although the P-35s were consistently outmaneuvered and several of them were seriously damaged, their pilots claimed 3 of the enemy aircraft. The results at Clark Field were devastating. 12 B-17 flying fortresses were destroyed and 3 badly damaged, mostly by strafing, almost half the heavy bomber inventory of the Far East Air Force. 35 fighters were destroyed on the ground or in the air, and that was not all. Communications from Iber Field and its precious radar had ended abruptly for a reason. The second of the 2 air formations reported by the radar at Iber, consisting of 26 Bettys of the Kanoya Air Group and 27 Nells of the Takao Air Group, escorted by 51 Zeros, had in fact attacked Iber Field. The 3rd Pursuit Squadron had patrolled the South China Sea until their fuel was dangerously low, then headed back for Iber. 12 had managed to land, with the remainder in the landing pattern, when the bomber force and its escort of Zeros struck. With their fuel almost gone, the remaining airborne P-40s had very limited options, but they tried to make the most of them. Lieutenant Jack Donaldson was credited with destroying 2 Japanese aircraft. They also managed to frustrate Japanese attempts to copy the devastating strafing runs made at Clark Field, but that was just about the only bright light in an otherwise very dark scene. 5 P-44s were shot down, and 3 others crash-landed when their fuel ran out. Of the 3rd Pursuit Squadron's P-40s, only 2 escaped destruction. Barracks and service buildings were smashed. Aircraft maintenance equipment and spare parts were lost. Worst of all, the Iber radar installation was destroyed. No more would there be early warning of Japanese air attacks. With one brilliantly planned and executed attack, and one utterly incompetent, negligent defense by the Americans, the Japanese had destroyed half the Far East Air Force, the largest and most modern Allied air force in the East, and all of its offensive capability. The United States still had 18 B-17 flying fortresses and about 45 P-40 Warhawks remaining in the Philippines, but they no longer had anywhere near the numbers to be more than a nuisance to the enemy. The Japanese, with over 400 aircraft available, had almost total air superiority over the Philippines. Once the remnants of the Far East Air Force were ground down or forced to withdraw, the Japanese Naval Air Force's 11th Air Fleet would redeploy to points south to keep the momentum of the Japanese offensive. The Japanese Naval Air Force would use the control of the air gained at Clark Field to expand south. The Americans would never again get enough air replacements back into the Far East to challenge Japanese air superiority. From now on, American, British, Dutch and Australian forces would have to operate in the constant fear of air attack. Precisely what happened that morning of December 8, 1941, on Luzon has been the subject of considerable examination, analytical articles, and numerous books. The issues boil down to two questions. First, why was the long-planned attack on Formosa delayed? Second, why were there no American pursuits positioned to defend Clark Field and Iber Field? The second question is more easily addressed than the first. Major Grover's deployment of his pursuits to Manila was nothing short of abysmal and was arguably negligent. He left the biggest airbase and a major secondary airbase unguarded to protect Manila. Precisely why he felt the need to protect Manila instead of the airfields is unclear, but that is beside the point. Long-term, Manila could not be protected without the airfields. Even worse, since the Japanese were coming from the north, it was possible to protect Manila from positions over Clark and Iber fields, but not vice versa. Major Grover did offer something of a defense in his after-action report on the engagement. Grover claims that he ordered the 34th Pursuit Squadron to deploy over Clark Field. His word is the only evidence that he actually did so, but claims that the 34th was given orders on two different occasions that morning, but received neither should give pause for thought. Again, however, that is beside the point. Grover had therefore ordered his best interceptors, the P-40S, to protect Manila while ordering only the obsolete P-35s of the 34th Squadron to protect his largest and most important airbase, which goes back to the question of what was Grover thinking or not thinking. Also unanswered is why Major Grover gave no orders for the 20th Pursuit Squadron to defend Clark Field, where its Warhawks remained on the ground to be shot to ribbons. It is hard to escape the conclusion, however improbable, that Grover simply forgot about the 20th. One historian called Grover's decisions here hard to understand, bewildering and fatal. Returning to the first major question about the events of December 8, 1941, and why the planned airstrike on Formosa was never launched, it becomes necessary to examine a second question intertwined with the first. What was going on in General Douglas MacArthur's office that morning? The major feature of the first hours in the Philippines after the attack on Pearl Harbor is the disappearance of Douglas MacArthur. Precisely what MacArthur was doing all morning, between 3:30 a.m. when he was informed of the Pearl Harbor attack, and 10:15 a.m. when he called Brereton, and why Sutherland continually blocked General Brereton's access to him, remains an enduring mystery. Those who did see MacArthur that morning disagree as to what he was doing, but the descriptions of the commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East are disturbing. Historian John Costello, author of The Pacific War, 1941 to 1945, states that MacArthur was in an apparent cataleptic state, and that the shock of events seemed to have clouded his judgment. Historian Eric Morris supports this when he relates that an air of unreality gripped MacArthur at his headquarters. MacArthur biographer William Manchester says the general was numbed, and reports that those around MacArthur described him as grey, ill, and exhausted that morning. Historian Michael Gough says MacArthur simply froze. Historian Stanley Weintraub considered the possibility that General Sutherland was trying to shield a MacArthur in shock. Had he, Sutherland, been making decisions by reading MacArthur's mind rather than consulting him? Nothing of the sort fits MacArthur's own inglorious know-nothing account. One must return to the image of a stunned, pyjama-clad figure, more proconsul than general, sitting on his bed in the pre-dawn darkness and reaching for his Bible rather than rushing to action. A paralysis of will, in part concealed by loyal lieutenants. A comment to the official Air Force history states, "Considering other events and MacArthur's non-appearance throughout the morning of that critical day, this student believes that a plausible explanation is that MacArthur suffered at least a mild nervous breakdown upon receiving the news of Pearl Harbor and realizing his inevitable defeat in the Philippines, and that Sutherland's primary task that morning was to get the boss to pull himself together and assume effective command." After the efforts that MacArthur had initiated to repudiate the long-standing strategy of delay and defend until the fleet could arrive to reinforce, in favor of an aggressive forward defense relying largely on the striking power of the B-17s he demanded, It boggles the mind to discover another believable explanation for his failure to even meet face-to-face with his Air Force chief that morning. Further evidence of his tenuous response to events is his continued commitment to a forward defense of the beaches, until he precipitously abandoned those plans in favor of the retreat to Bataan immediately after the Japanese landing at Lingayen Gulf, too late to move the mountains of material needed to feed and support his army. The explanation that MacArthur suffered a nervous breakdown when he heard about Pearl Harbor seems to be the most likely and yet perhaps the most kind explanation for his behavior in those first few hours. For months, MacArthur had been convinced and had publicly stated that the Japanese would not attack until March 1942, or the warm season, as he called it. His defense plans for the Philippines depended on that timetable. As the signs that war was imminent grew in number, he seemed uninterested in hearing about those signs, or even in finding out whether those signs existed. A very plausible scenario would be that when the Japanese finally started the war by attacking Pearl Harbor, MacArthur at first refused to accept that the Japanese had attacked this quickly, that his own forces were not prepared for the war, and perhaps most importantly, that he, Douglas MacArthur, had been wrong. As the morning went on, and perhaps at General Sutherland's prodding, MacArthur shifted his belief that the Japanese had not started the war to a belief that the Japanese would not attack the Philippines, even though they already had. It may have been only the relentless reports of Japanese incursions and attacks that snapped MacArthur out of his state of unreality. At 10:15 a.m., he finally gave the order to proceed with the attack on Formosa. It is difficult and unseemly to criticize someone who makes serious or even catastrophic mistakes because of a mental breakdown. Even the best and toughest of warriors can break under the mental pressures of war for which no training can prepare. MacArthur biographer William Manchester notes that even Napoleon, George Washington, and Stonewall Jackson suffered similar lapses. But any sensitivity to MacArthur's all-too-human plight must be tempered with knowledge of the absolute viciousness and outright dishonesty that he would use to blame others, especially those such as Admiral Hart, who actually had done their jobs well for the disaster unfolding in the Philippines. As General Brereton bitterly put it, the first overt act had been committed. The Japanese had hit us and hurt us. American air power in the Far East was in ruins. And from Pearl Harbor came this chilling message: the Pacific Fleet has been immobilized. The Pacific War was 8 hours old. The British had not been able to determine exactly what happened to Flying Officer Bedell's Catalina off the coast of Cambodia, but even without hard evidence they had strong suspicions that the Japanese would confirm shortly after midnight on December 8th. The Japanese invasion begins, December 8th. A storm front over the South China Sea had prevented any effective aerial search, but the British Far East Command in Singapore had caught glimpses of what might be hiding behind that storm front. Those glimpses were not encouraging. At 3:45 p.m., a Royal Australian Air Force Hudson operating out of Kuantan spotted a Japanese ship with a large number of men on deck in Kaki, north of Kota Baru, headed west. 2 Hudsons of No. 1 Squadron were sent out of the Kota Baru Air Base to investigate this report. Early in the evening, they reported 4 unidentified ships approximately 60 miles from the coast. At 5:50 p.m., one of the Hudsons sighted 2 ships 120 miles north of Kota Baru, both headed toward Kota Baru itself. One of the ships, which the Hudson judged to be a cruiser but was later identified as the destroyer Uranami, opened Phi Ray on the Hudson and drove it off. Because of nightfall and the storm, the British could carry out no further reconnaissance. Kota Baru was part of a small network of British airdromes in northern Malaya. With the Malay Peninsula divided longitudinally by a mountain range that in some places topped 7,000 feet, the British Far East Command had placed pairs of airdromes on each side of the mountain range near the Thai border. To the west lay Alor Setar, just inland from the Andaman Sea coast, and, to its southeast, Sungai Patani. To the east, on the coast of the South China Sea, were Kota Baru and, to its southeast, Gong Kedah. Positioned in and around these bases were British air and army assets to counter a Japanese invasion of Thailand. Although it was by no means certain, for some time London and the Far East Command had believed there was a strong possibility the Japanese would invade Thailand to secure their supply lines before moving on to Malaya. In fact, British military planners had hoped this would be the case. Operation Matador, by which British Army troops would cross the border from northern Malaya into Thailand and establish defensive positions at key beaches, airfields, ports and roads, was designed to prevent any successful invasion. A less ambitious operation, called Operation Crocol, had also been planned to seize a defensive position 30 miles inside Thailand, at a place called the Ledge, a road cut into the side of a mountain that led into Malaya. British and Dominion troops were positioned to execute either of these plans, waiting in the pouring rain for the orders to proceed. But both of these plans had one major flaw. Because of international political considerations, the British could not invade the nominally neutral Thailand until the Japanese did. This meant that the British needed clear warning of a Japanese invasion. The storm was conveniently covering the Japanese Malaya Force, the current designation of the Western Force, under the command of Vice Admiral Ozawa, operating from the relatively luxurious heavy cruiser Chokai. Ozawa was trailing behind the invasion force's close escort, the Kota Baru invasion force, under Rear Admiral Hashimoto Shintaro, consisting of his flagship light cruiser Sendai, the destroyers Ayanami, Isunami, Shikinami, and the aforementioned Uranami, minesweepers W2 and W3, and sub-chaser CH-9. With them were the transports Awagisan Maru, Ayatosan Maru, and Sakura Maru, carrying 5,300 army troops of the so-called Takumi Detachment, named after their commander Major General Takumi Hiroshi. These were troops of the 56th Regiment of the 18th Division, veterans of the war in China. Their destination was Sabak Beach, near Kota Baru. The British knew the Japanese had something underneath the storm, but that same storm prevented them from learning exactly where the Japanese were headed. Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham had been given authority to begin Operation Matador, and British troops had been positioned on the Thai-Malayan border, but he understandably could not bring himself to pull the trigger without more evidence. In fact, the Japanese were about to conduct the very ambitious amphibious invasion of the Kra Isthmus, the narrowest part of the Malayan peninsula in southern Thailand that the British had feared. Landings on Kota Baru, Singora, Tefa and Patani were followed a few hours later on December 8th by landings at 4 ports further north, Nakhon Sri Thammarat, Bandhan, Chumphon and Prachuap. So would start the first Japanese landing to drive out the Westerners. The irony that their first invasion to see Asia ruled by Asians was of Thailand, a part of Asia already ruled by Asians, seems to have been lost on the Japanese. After resistance that might generously be described as half-hearted, the Thai government surrendered. Unfortunately for the British, their first indication of the Japanese objective came at approximately midnight on December 8th, still a little more than an hour before Pearl Harbor, when Indian troops patrolling the beach fronting Kota Baru sighted the 3 Japanese transports in the gloom offshore. Moments later came the naval artillery, 5-inch shells that pounded the beach in advance of the landing craft that were now approaching. But the same storm that had covered the invasion force's approach also caused problems for the landing itself. High winds churned the water and capsized several landing craft, roughing up the invaders even before they had a chance to close with the enemy. The British defenders of Kota Baru may have been outnumbered and outgunned, but their response to the Japanese attack was both swift and efficient. The area was defended by the 8th Indian Infantry Brigade of the 9th Indian Infantry Division, supported by 4 3.7-inch mountain howitzers of the 21st Mountain Battery. Sabak Beach and the neighbouring Badang Beach were the responsibility of the 3rd 17th Battalion, Dogra Regiment, supported by the 73rd Field Battery of the 5th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, deployed adjacent to the Kota Baru Air Base just a mile and a half back from the beach. The British had fortified the narrow beaches and islands with landmines, barbed wire and bunkers. The Imperial Japanese Army began to feel the full weight of those fortifications. The sounds of explosions and small arms fire reached the airbase and spurred a quick report. Air Vice Marshal Pulford reacted quickly to the news of the landing by immediately ordering an all-out attack on the invasion transports. In this context, an all-out attack was not much. Only 10 Lockheed Hudson bombers, all of the Royal Australian Air Force's number. 1 squadron were at Kota Baru, of which only 7 could be immediately armed with bombing loads. But the pilots were determined to make the most of what they had. At 2:08 a.m., To the sounds of explosions and the flicker of small arms fire in the darkness some 2 miles away, the Hudsons roared down the runway fully laden with 250-pound bombs and soared into the air. Because it was night, coordination of the aircraft was deemed impossible, so the pilots were instructed to make individual attacks. Their first counterattack resulted in at least 2 bomb hits on the 9,794-ton transport Awagisan Maru, setting it afire. One Hudson tried to strafe the Japanese infantry on the beach, but was shot up and crashed into a fully laden Japanese landing barge, killing the pilot, Flight Lieutenant John Leighton Jones, his crew and some 60 Japanese soldiers and sailors. The first wave returned to the airbase to rearm. As they did so, the second wave of 3 Hudsons started their attacks. The only one to achieve results was Flight Lieutenant Ken Smith and his crew, placing 2 bombs in a cluster of 10 landing barges, capsizing several and leaving the rest badly shaken. Another Hudson, its bombs having failed to release from their bomb racks, was sent out over the South China Sea to scout out enemy ships. On its return leg, it maneuvered for a low-level attack on a dark shape in the water. Unfortunately, the dark shape turned out to be not a relatively helpless transport, but the flagship Sendai, which launched an avalanche of anti-aircraft fire in return. Lucky to escape, pilot Flight Lieutenant John O'Brien now targeted the Japanese transport closest to shore and scored at least 1 bomb hit on the Awagisan Maru. Now the third wave of air attacks from the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 1 Squadron was underway. Flight Lieutenant Colin Vercoe scored at least 1 bomb hit on the Sakura Maru. Lieutenant Smith had a stick of 4 bombs straddle the Ayatosan Maru, damaging the thin-skinned transport. Another Hudson, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Oscar Diamond, dropped an additional bomb on the burning Awagisan Maru, exploding just forward of the bridge and starting yet another fire. The Australian pilots continued this pattern of making low-level bombing runs, rearming and taking off again until 5 a.m., but Japanese anti-aircraft fire took a severe toll, shooting down at least 2 Hudsons and badly damaging 3 others to the point where they had to be written off. Nevertheless, Admiral Hashimoto had had enough of the pounding and ordered an immediate withdrawal. General Takumi convinced the harried Hashimoto to give him more time to reinforce his troops fighting on the beach. So at 6 a.m. all the Japanese ships that could headed back out to sea with the exception of the Awagisan Maru, burning fiercely and with at least 110 killed or wounded. The Japanese were fortunate in heading out to sea as the plucky Royal Australian Air Force No. 1 Squadron had been joined by 7 Vickers Wildebeest torpedo bombers of the Royal Air Force's No. 36 Squadron to continue the fight. Flying out of Gong Kedah, they were sent out after the temporarily retreating transports, but the stormy conditions worsened, and the combination of wind, rain and anti-aircraft fire so battered these antiquated fabric-covered biplanes that only 4 managed to release their torpedoes, scoring no hits. At about 8 a.m., 12 Hudsons from the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 8 Squadron arrived overhead. Based in Kuantan, which would unwittingly have a decisive role in the days ahead, No. 8 had been informed at 2 a.m. of the landings at Kota Bharu. It had taken off at 6:30 a.m., and after forming in 4 flights of 3, sped to the battlefield. The Kota Bharu Air Base had sent warnings that the Japanese ships were withdrawing, but the first flight missed the signal and bored in on the transport closest to shore, the luckless Awagisan Maru. They added at least another bomb to her collection, but it was for naught. The burning transport had already been abandoned. The remaining Hudsons pursued the retreating ships, but the invasion convoy had already disappeared under cover of the storm front. Despairing of finding the ships in the murk, Flight Lieutenant Charles Spud Spurgeon chose to make a low-level bombing run on the transport closest to shore, which was, once again, the Awagisan Maru. He added another bomb to her misery, but added to his own as well when shrapnel from his bomb's explosion tore into his Hudson and forced it to crash land at Kota Bharu. Of the 12 aircraft in this attack, 5 were damaged. The Far East Air Command in Singapore, in another example of commendable British efficiency in the early hours of the Pacific War, had ordered all hands on deck, trying to get every serviceable bomber in their inventory to strike at the Japanese off Kota Bharu, but they were outnumbered, outgunned and uncoordinated. Worse, by this time, Japanese Zeros from the 22nd Air Flotilla were making their appearance after covering the other landings on the Kra Isthmus. They arrived just in time to foil a last effort by the No. 8 and depleted No. 1 squadrons to provide air support to the hard-pressed British Army troops on the ground. 8 Bristol Blenheim bombers of the Royal Air Force's No. 60 Squadron came in to lend a hand, managing to obtain 1 bomb hit, once again on the Awagisan Maru, but were chewed up by anti-aircraft fire, suffering 2 shot down and a third badly damaged. The Awagisan Maru would have the dubious distinction of being the first Japanese ship sunk in World War II. Precisely when and where is disputed. British and American sources indicate that the Blenheims achieved the very last hit on the hapless transport and finally put her under. But on December 12th, the Dutch submarine K-12, under the command of Lieutenant Commander H.C.J. Kumu, torpedoed and sank an unidentified ship off Kota Baru. The description of the ship given in Dutch logs precisely matches that of the Awagisan Maru. Either way, the case of the Awagisan Maru was mostly but perhaps not entirely to the credit of the Royal Air Force. The unarmoured transport had survived at least 6 bomb hits and possibly a 7th without sinking, which did not speak well of the effectiveness of the 250-pound bombs the British were using. That was not the fault of the pilots, but their consistent choice to attack a burning, disabled and later abandoned transport when other targets were available is open to question. Nevertheless, the pilots of the Royal Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force and the Indian Infantry had ample reason to be proud. The defence of Kota Baru was the first time a Japanese invasion fleet had been forced to turn back before it could fully complete its landing operations. It was the only time an invasion fleet had been repulsed by air power alone. The Japanese planning for the invasion, which would go so well almost everywhere else, had been botched at Kota Baru inasmuch as they had not first neutralized the airbase with naval artillery fire. Japanese infantry had suffered heavy losses. The performance of the British and Australian pilots and the Indian troops had been brave, determined and resourceful, and ultimately for naught. There were just too few British, Australians and Indians and too many Japanese. By mid-morning, General Takumi had 3 full infantry battalions ashore. By 10:30 a.m. they had reached Kota Baru. Within a day the British would be forced to abandon the airbase. It would have a ripple effect down the Malay Peninsula and well into the South China Sea. The British defence. Force Z sets sail, December 8th. Unfortunately for the British, their spirited and determined but ultimately futile defence of Kota Baru would prove to be the high point of their defence of Malaya. Some of that was the result of a bad call. Far East Command had guessed that the Japanese would take over northern Thailand before moving into the Kra Isthmus and Malaya. Army and air forces were positioned to block that move from Thailand into Malaya, but the Japanese had instead invaded the Kra Isthmus with help from the Thais and Malaya itself. The British were now overextended. Their guess as to the Japanese objective had been educated and reasonable, but wrong. On the evening of December 7th, Admiral Phillips met with Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham and General Arthur Percival, the British Army commander in Malaya, to develop an operational plan that they would communicate with London. The Admiralty had asked Phillips about options for contesting the Japanese expedition given the forces he had. Phillips sent a message back to London saying that if his force was inferior to that of the Japanese, he would try a hit-and-run raid, but otherwise he would try to attack the invasion forces. His message received no response. It seemed apparent by this time that Phillips's deterrent force was failing to deter, but London simply had no idea what to do next. Shortly after midnight on December 8th, Marshal Brooke Popham told London he could not execute Operation Matador, the operation to take up defensive positions within Thai territory. But he did put into effect Operation Krokol, the less ambitious plan that aimed to capture the ledge, 30 miles inside Thailand. Unfortunately, Krokol would fail miserably. The British troops were stymied and driven back by the fierce resistance of Thai police who were likely disguised Japanese troops. Worse, because the British Army troops had been positioned to carry out Matador and Krokol, they were now out of position to defend against the actual Japanese invasion. It was at about 3:30 a.m. that apparently a curious and rather mysterious meeting of the British leadership in Malaya took place in a darkened war room deep in the bowels of the Singapore naval base. The meeting included Admiral Phillips with his staff, Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham with members of his staff, Air Vice Marshal Conway Pulford, commander of the Royal Air Force in the Far East, and the British civilian leadership in Malaya. When and why the meeting was called remains unclear, but the main topic for discussion was, in the appalling absence of direction from London, the course of action to be determined for Phillips and his naval forces, whether to flee the superior Japanese forces or fight them. The main reason for the meeting seems to have been Admiral Phillips's wish to secure some political backing for what he knew would be a risky sortie by the Prince of Wales, and repulse to attempt to derail the Japanese invasion. He preferred to fight rather than retreat to Ceylon, Australia, or the East Indies, but he was reluctant, at least outwardly, to risk his two capital ships, the only Royal Navy capital ships in the Far East, in an attack on the Japanese invasion convoys, unless he got an authoritative statement that it was absolutely necessary for the defence of Malaya. This he secured from Brooke Popham, although it has been alleged that Phillips manoeuvred Brooke Popham into making that statement. Admiral Phillips spent considerable time and effort explaining his concern about air attacks, especially those from torpedo bombers, and trying to secure some form of air protection for his ships. Air Vice Marshal Pulford gave some disheartening information about the limitations of his aircraft and his pilots, who were not trained to fly over water, but agreed to provide air cover within those limitations. The meeting is revealing inasmuch as, for someone allegedly deeply committed to the idea of battleship supremacy, the battleship Admiral Phillips seemed determined to get some type of air protection. He stated that he did not fear high-level bombers or dive bombers, the former because of their relative inaccuracy, the latter because none were known to be nearby. But he also believed that an attack by Japanese torpedo bombers operating out of Saigon, though unlikely due to the weather conditions and what was believed to be their effective operating range, would be extremely dangerous. The mysterious meeting was effectively ended at around 4:15 a.m. with an air raid warning, and yet another sign that the British had badly underestimated the Japanese. The Far East Command had been convinced that the Japanese bombers based in Saigon did not have the range to reach Singapore. When 17 of those Japanese bombers, G3M Nels of the Mihoro Air Group, appeared over Singapore in the pre-dawn darkness and began bombing the city, the British authorities began to re-evaluate this belief. General Percival later said the bombing was rather a surprise. The bombing itself was largely ineffectual Singapore's main port at Keppel Harbour, and the airfields at Seletar and Tengah suffered very minor damage, but it showed that British planning for the defence of Singapore and Malaya was far worse than had been originally thought. For instance, when the bombers appeared at 4:15 a.m., Singapore was brilliantly lit, practically a beacon guiding the Japanese to their targets. Most of the anti-aircraft positions were not manned, and anti-aircraft fire from Singapore City was almost non-existent. The most effective fire came from the anti-aircraft batteries of the Prince of Wales, and repulse docked at the naval base. Finally, the bombing was almost over before the air raid sirens sounded. The Japanese had been ashore in Malaya for 4 hours, yet Singapore air defence was still woefully underprepared, and it did not stop there. Flight Lieutenant Tim Viggers, acting commander of the Royal Air Force's No. 453 Squadron and a decorated Battle of Britain veteran with night fighting experience, asked for permission to take 3 Brewster Buffaloes from the Sembawang airfield up to intercept the bombers. His request was denied on the grounds that they did not want to expose the fighters to the friendly fire of the local anti-aircraft gunners. Additionally, the Buffalo was not a night fighter. The Royal Air Force did have night fighters twin-engine Buffords, but they were positioned in the north at Sungai Petani because they were designated ground attack aircraft. Sometimes bureaucracy was almost as much of an enemy as the Japanese. Upon conclusion of the bombing-disrupted meeting, Admiral Phillips directed a message declaring his intentions to sail and try to disrupt the Japanese landing operations, to be transmitted to the Admiralty. London acknowledged receipt of the signal at 9:30 a.m., but otherwise gave no answer. Admiral Phillips returned to the war room at 6:30 a.m. to work out the details of his operation with his Chief of Staff, Admiral Arthur F.E. Palliser, and Admiral Sir Geoffrey Leighton, the commander of the Royal Navy's China Station, which had been dissolved to be merged with Phillips's new Eastern Fleet. At this point, the seriousness of the situation off Kota Baru became apparent and necessitated that Kota Baru should become the objective rather than Singora. Phillips, apparently very concerned about having enough destroyers to give his capital ships decent anti-submarine protection, was heard to say, "I certainly can't go to sea until I have some more destroyers." But that issue was apparently dealt with to his satisfaction, and at 9:34 a.m. Phillips sent another signal to the Admiralty, stating in relevant part, "Provided that as I hope I can make 4 destroyers available, intend to proceed with Prince of Wales and repulse dusk tonight, 8th of December, to attack enemy force off Kota Baru daylight, Wednesday 10th. Again, he was giving London a chance to tell him not to go, and once again his message got no reaction from London. As December 8th wore on, it became apparent that the British Army and Royal Air Force units in northern Malaya were in trouble. The British Army units were simply overextended and could not resist effectively until they could reassemble. The Royal Air Force's aircraft were being chewed up by the Japanese. Combat was showing that, contrary to Air Marshal Brooke Popham's assertions, the Buffalo was simply not good enough for Malaya, or for much else, all of which put even more pressure on Admiral Phillips to do something. At around 12:30 p.m, Phillips held a council of war in his cabin on the Prince of Wales with members of his staff, Captain Leach and Captain Tennant. Looking ill and damp from the sweltering conditions below decks on the flagship, Phillips, concisely and in sharp tones, laid out the deteriorating situation in northern Malaya and their unhappy options in response. Stay in harbour waiting for reinforcements and get bombed, retreat to the Indian Ocean, or counterattack. The first 2 options were non-starters, especially with British and Dominion troops fighting and dying in northern Malaya. Retreating in particular, while probably the smartest option, was almost profane given the fanfare with which the Prince of Wales and Repulse had arrived in Singapore. But the counterattack option was dangerous, as Phillips well knew. It was for that reason that he assembled a small, high-speed task force. The ships available at Singapore, in addition to the Prince of Wales and Repulse, were the light cruisers HMS Durban, Danae, Dragon and Mauritius, and the destroyers HMS Express, Electra, Tenedos, Stronghold, Encounter, Jupiter, and the Australian HMAS Vampire. En route to Singapore and set to arrive within days were the 8-inch armed heavy cruiser HMS Exeter, the Dutch light cruiser Java, the World War I era British destroyers HMS Scout and Thanet, and the US Destroyer Division 57, with the destroyers USS Whipple, John D. Edwards, Edsall and Alden, ordered over by Admiral Hart to support the British. But Admiral Phillips knew he could not wait. Danae, Dragon, Mauritius, Encounter and Jupiter were undergoing repairs and not ready. Durban and Stronghold were too slow for the fast task force that Phillips wanted. That left the battleship Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser Repulse, the Royal Navy destroyers Express, Electra and the World War I vintage Tenedos and Vampire for this raiding force. The plan was a relatively simple hit-and-run operation based on surprise and speed. They would sail into the Gulf of Siam and let British air reconnaissance of Japanese movements determine their target as Singora or Kota Baru. Admiral Phillips would wreak havoc on whatever invasion beaches the scout aircraft identified, then make a high-speed run back to Singapore. An exception was to be made for an opportunity to strike at the main elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Intelligence officials had reported that the invasion operations had a covering force of 7 cruisers, 20 destroyers, and only 1 capital ship, a Congo-class battleship. If they had a chance to engage and sink the Congo with the Prince of Wales's superior gunpower, they would do so. Otherwise, their target would be the invasion beaches and their supporting transports. Aside from the aforementioned Congo, there were, in Admiral Phillips's view, 2 major dangers: submarines and aircraft. Phillips had been informed that on December 2nd, US Navy Catalinas had spotted 12 Japanese submarines off Indochina heading south, likely toward his capital ships, and that mines were a strong possibility along his transit route. His hope was that his destroyers would keep the Japanese boats at bay. In any event, his ships could easily outrun submerged submarines. A far bigger concern was Japanese air power. Admiral Phillips had termed the French cessation of Indochina to the Japanese as France's most dastardly deed, and was well aware of the dangers posed by the Saigon airbase complex, especially aerial torpedo attacks. The admiral apparently stated that no shore-based torpedo attack on ships at sea had been delivered at a range of greater than 200 miles, at least none that he knew of. Based on this experience, if they stayed outside a 200-mile radius of Kamau, Indochina, where the British believed the Japanese had an airbase, they would be outside the limit of the effective range of Japanese aerial torpedo attack. Apparently, however, Phillips was not entirely confident of this analysis. So he would time the return run to Singapore to minimize daylight exposure and would try to obtain air cover. Admiral Phillips had called the meeting more as an affirmation of a decision he had already made than as a true council of war, but he did give everyone a chance to speak, asking, "Now what do you think of this plan?" The response he got was a long, thoughtful silence. It was the widely respected Captain Tennant of the Repulse who first declared his support for the operation. "We've come to secure our communications. That was our purpose. Now that we're here, I don't see what possible alternative we have but to do as you proposed." At the end of his presentation, the Admiral asked, "Does anyone think we shouldn't go?" The response, all were unanimous that it was impossible for the Navy to attempt nothing while the Army and Air Force were being driven back, and that the plan for a sudden raid, though hazardous, was acceptable. There was also the psychological effect of the fleet putting to sea in this grave emergency. This meeting lasted about half an hour. Shortly thereafter, at about 1:30 p.m., Admiral Phillips held a second, larger meeting with his staff and the skippers of his raiding force. It went much like the first meeting. "Gentlemen," Admiral Phillips bluntly declared, "this is an extremely hazardous expedition. Nevertheless, I feel that we have got to do something." The Admiral sought opinions, but the issue was never in doubt. He wanted to attack. His staff and his skippers wanted to attack. They did not want to abandon their comrades fighting in northern Malaya, and they wanted a chance to strike back at the Japanese aggressors. After the discussion was over, Admiral Phillips concluded this second meeting with the summation, "We can stay in Singapore. We can sail away to the East Australia, or we can go out and fight. Gentlemen, we sail at 5 o'clock. So, on a day when indecision and paralysis was seemingly the rule, Admiral Phillips, in whom the spirit of Drake and Nelson burned with a fierce fire, was the exception and took the initiative, for which he would ultimately pay with his life. His was a logical plan, with 3 serious drawbacks. The first Admiral Phillips could not control. The Japanese invasion would be largely completed by the end of the day on December 9th. If he had wanted to stop the invasion at sea, he needed to have been at sea a few days before, but that option had been unavailable because of political considerations. It was already simply too late. The second was the nature of the task force itself. With 2 capital ships and 4 destroyers, no cruisers, not many destroyers, and no air power, it was badly unbalanced. In reality, it was much the same problem Admiral Phillips had had since leaving the United Kingdom. This was just the best he could do. The third problem, very much related to the second, was air cover. The Japanese were deploying significant air assets in their invasion of Malaya. Admiral Phillips's reputation as a battleship admiral preceded him, but once again, for someone who allegedly believed firmly that aircraft could not sink battleships, he spent a lot of effort analyzing the threat from air attack and trying to get fighter protection for his ships. His estimate of the effective range of what he really feared, aerial torpedo attack, based on the British experience with the Germans and Italians, was logical. It was also wrong. The Japanese bombers based in Indochina in reality had a range of about 1,000 miles. It was but one of a number of catastrophic miscalculations about Japanese aerial capabilities, but Phillips had tried to hedge his bets. Earlier that morning, he had placed a request in to Air Vice Marshal Pulford for air support in the form of 1. Aerial reconnaissance 100 miles north of Phillips's force during daylight on December 9th, 2. Reconnaissance off Singora at dawn on December 10th, and 3. Fighter protection off Singora during daylight on December 10th. Air Vice Marshal Pulford could provide the reconnaissance, but with the heavy losses in northern Malaya, fighter protection was an increasing struggle. Lieutenant Viggers of the No. 453 Squadron proposed a plan to keep 6 aircraft over Phillips's force during daylight. The problem was that the squadron's Buffaloes did not have the range to reach Singora and provide the necessary air cover. There was no other guarantee of any other fighter protection. Phillips rejected his plan. On the grounds, it required him to stay within 60 miles of the coast, which restricted his freedom of movement too much. Ultimately, it was arranged that Admiral Phillips could call on the number 453 Squadron, which would be on standby at Sembawang if he needed them. Regarding Phillips's decision to proceed, naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote, "Those who make the decisions in war are constantly weighing certain risks against possible gains." At the outset of hostilities, Admiral Hart thought of sending his small striking force north of Luzon to challenge Japanese communications, but decided that the risk to his ships outweighed the possible gain because the enemy had won control of the air. Admiral Phillips had precisely the same problem in Malaya. Should he steam into the Gulf of Siam and expose his ships to air attack from Indochina in the hope of breaking enemy communications with their landing force? He decided to take the chance. With the Royal Air Force and the British Army fighting for their lives, the Royal Navy could not be true to its tradition by remaining idly at anchor. Arthur Nicholson, in his respected history of the operation, perhaps said it best. Admiral Phillips's decision was one that was fully in accord with Royal Navy traditions of attacking the enemy, no matter what the odds, and of going to the assistance of the army. The Royal Navy had not built its magnificent reputation over the centuries by avoiding battle. The Admiral would leave behind his Chief of Staff, Admiral Palliser, to act as a liaison with the Royal Air Force in general, and to try to arrange that fighter cover off Singora on December 10th in particular. Palliser would also provide Admiral Phillips with intelligence information and logistical assistance from shore. Admiral Phillips had a few other issues involving his ships. Departure was delayed because the Prince of Wales had a boiler under repair. Without it, she could not go at full speed. Of greater concern was her state-of-the-art anti-aircraft fire control radar. Like the battleship's ventilation system, the radar had been designed for the cold North Sea and North Atlantic, not the heat and humidity of the tropics. The radar had not taken too well to the tropics and had broken down en route to Singapore. On the afternoon of December 8th, after the Prince of Wales had been in Singapore for almost a week and just hours before she was to sail, it finally occurred to someone that the radar should be fixed. 3 Royal Air Force technicians were sent on board, but could not fix it within the time frame. The Prince of Wales would have to sail without it. With that rather large oversight not taken care of, at 5:10 p.m. on December 8, 1941, the Vampire moved off from the Singapore naval base into the Johor Strait, followed by the Tornadoes, then the Repulse, and finally the flagship Prince of Wales. They would meet the Express and Electra, practicing their minesweeping outside the harbour. It was this puny force of 6 ships that Admiral Phillips was taking into the South China Sea to fight the massive Japanese invasion. Just before sailing, Phillips officially gave this task force the name that would, for all the wrong reasons, become famous: Force Z. It was a sombre procession, with more than a touch of dread. Admiral Leighton called the procession a pathetic sight and did not expect to see the ships again. One staff officer expected them to be slaughtered. Royal Marine Maurice Edwards from the Prince of Wales recalled, "As we left the Straits of Johor, I had a terrible feeling of foreboding. We just didn't know what we were going to encounter. But one thing I do remember is being convinced that we'd never get back to the colony in one piece." As the force sailed through the Johor Strait, a message was flashed from Air Vice Marshal Pulford, a response to Admiral Phillips's last plea for air cover. "Regret fighter protection impossible." "Well, we must get on without it," the Admiral shrugged. On board the Repulse, her skipper, Captain William G. Tennant, addressed his crew on their newest mission. "We are off to look for trouble," Captain Tennant said. "I expect we shall find it.